This is the Cambridge Creative Writing Centre series of conversations with writers. Thank you for joining us. Today I'm in conversation with Dr. Louise Fryer, a Cambridge graduate, research fellow at the University of Surrey, and expert in audio description. She is also the author of An Introduction to Audio Description, a Practical Guide. Welcome, Louise.
Thank you.
It's really nice to see you. So first of all, can you tell us what is audio description?
Yeah, audio description is a way of bringing access to people who are blind or partially sighted to media, so film, TV, theatre, museums, whatever you want. Anything that has a visual component that they can't fully engage with because of their sight impairment.
Right, brilliant. So how can you kind of tell us how it would work? So maybe live and also
in different settings. So
yeah.
If you wanted to go to the theatre and enjoy what was happening, you would possibly before it started have some kind of introduction. So there'd be a 15-minute thing you could listen to in advance, describing the set and the costumes and the kind of style of the production. So whether or not there was a scene change in full view or a curtain comes across, that kind of thing. And so when you arrive at the theatre, you might have a touch tour. So you'd be invited onto the stage to meet some of the actors and to move around the space, so you have a kind of embodied understanding of the way the set was laid out. And then during the show itself, you'd listen via headphones. And when none of the cast was speaking, you'd have a voice telling you who was coming in, who was going out, who was lying on the floor, or whatever was happening.
Right, so is that bit scripted? So would you prepare that in advance?
Yeah, that bit's scripted. So the way it works is that you go and see the show, make lots of notes, and then usually take away some kind of video. And then you work with video, making sure that your description fits precisely into the gaps. But the problem is that then when the actors do it again, they don't stick to the same timing necessarily. So then you have to improvise around your script.
Yeah, so that sounds really creative to me, and really interesting, because you've got to, I suppose, a certain word length that you can use where you can speak when the actors aren't speaking, but also you can't relax presumably for a minute.
You can't relax for a minute, and your eyes are everywhere. Your eyes are on the stage and on your script, and looking at your microphone to check that you're going out and people can hear you, and it's kind of multitasking big time.
Which sounds fantastic. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should say that I know you really well. So we were at school together. And I know that those kinds of skills fit exactly what you're good at. But I think it's interesting that this job really just wouldn't have existed when we were at school together.
On the career advisors list, I was supposed to be an accountant.
Were you? Well, obviously, you're a born accountant. But just tell me how you got into it. So you went from school to Cambridge to study archaeology and anthropology, and then what happened after that?
Well, mostly when I was at college, although I was supposed to be studying archaeology and anthropology, I did bits and pieces of acting. So I was in shows, musicals, straight plays, whatever. And then when I left college, I carried on doing bits and pieces of acting. And someone I'd been at college with was working at the National Theatre. It's always about who you know, isn't it?
Yeah.
And they were recruiting people to train as audio describers. I didn't know what an audio describer was. I didn't know anybody who was blind. And I thought it sounded interesting. I'd done lots of work performing in special schools or with people with disabilities. And I was passionate about fairness and equality. So I went along kind of not really knowing what it was. And I found that it was something that I found really interesting and that I could do. So I stuck with it, and I still describe at the National Theatre.
Yeah.
Even in the times of COVID-19 and lockdown. So I'm now describing stuff that they're streaming online.
Oh, right. That's really interesting. So how long has audio description been going?
Well, arguably it's been going for years, but in the kind of formalized sense. So where it's provided by the theatre and where you wear headphones and listen and it's not available to everybody. That kind of system has been around since the mid-1980s. In the UK. It started a bit earlier in America and was an idea by an American academic who did it as his thesis at the University of somewhere in California. And someone in the UK heard about it. It was developed in Washington by something called the Washington Ear, and someone in the UK heard an item on In Touch, and she was blind. In Touch being the Radio 4 documentary program about things for blind people.
Mm-hmm.
She thought, this sounds great. I can't go to the theatre. I can't enjoy the theatre. I love the theatre. So she got together with someone from the RNIB. They went over, they found out how it was done. They brought it back to the UK. And that's a long way of saying it came to the UK really for theatre in kind of the late 1980s.
Right.
Which is when
Yeah. So I remember you playing Sally Bowles in Cabaret at Cambridge. It lives on with me.
Yeah,
I think
I'm sorry.
Outside in the Rain, I think. Is that right? I remember you singing and dancing and nearly falling over. Was that something else?
I think that was something else. That was Fiddler on the Roof in a rain.
Yes, yes.
He was in the ADC and
Yeah.
it was nice and dry.
Yes. So, and then you went on to be an announcer as well, didn't you, for the World Service? And
because it's just across the road from, just across the river from the National Theatre, and it's performing effectively to blind people.
Yeah.
People can't see what you're talking about. So there's a massive overlap between radio and description.
Mm-hmm. And how does it differ between the forms of performance? So how would describing something on TV or a film or in a gallery be different?
The massive difference between theatre and film and TV is that film and TV is recorded, so you know always exactly how long the gap is going to be. So you write precisely, you work with a time code, you think this is going to start at 1 minute and 53 seconds and I have to finish speaking by 1 minute and 58 seconds. I've got 5 seconds to speak, and I will always have 5 seconds to speak. Whereas in the theatre, you have 5 seconds to speak the first time you see it, but by the time they come to the end of the run, they're spread up a bit, they're used to their lines, or they might forget their next line completely. And then you have less time than you thought, or more time than you thought, or the stage stops working. There's a revolver at the National that gets stuck occasionally. And someone's ill, someone collapses. Oh, wow, did a show where one of the actors just fell over on the stage, just collapsed. And the audience thought it was a part of the show and they were laughing. And we as describers, having seen the show a lot, knew that it wasn't part of the show.
Yeah.
We were kind of, and then eventually someone said, is there a doctor in the house? There turned out to be about 30 doctors in the house because they were on a trip from their local hospital to come and see the show. So there's always something exciting to happen in a live performance.
So that's really interesting, because in that instance, did you tell the people listening that this wasn't part of the show? So they were privy to information that the other members, the sighted members of the audience, wouldn't have had, and presumably that's very unusual.
It's quite unusual. I think what we did was describe what was happening. So we'd say, he's fallen down. Now someone in black is coming onto the stage, and they made an announcement. So I don't think we actually gave more information, although occasionally we do.
Right. Have you got any other examples of where you would give more information?
I think if there's a hold up sometimes, so the show's not starting, we might know a reason for that, which the audience wouldn't know. We might say the main actor's been delayed on his way to the theatre, but he's expected shortly, that kind of thing.
And I remember talking to you about this a couple of years ago, and you said that you have to make quite interesting decisions about what you choose to describe. And you gave a really interesting example of an opera singer, so who tended to be perhaps a bit more slender than our kind of stereotypical opera singer. I mean, how do you deal with something like that? That's
become an enormous issue.
Yeah.
So currently theatres are getting concerned that we might be stereotyping their actors or describing them in an unflattering way that might then affect their casting abilities or availability for other shows. So by describing somebody as fat or, larger than your average person, or by describing someone's disability, if it's visible. That's slightly different again, because you might want to describe someone's disability because it raises the profile of disabled actors, or race is obviously a current issue. How you describe someone's race. Do you describe the color of their skin, or do you say they're from Jamaica, or what? And how do you know that? So we've more recently started working with theatres and asking actors to describe themselves. So then we use words that they're comfortable with, and they know that they're being described, and it's all much more open than it used to be.
Right, that's so interesting. So do you ever get an actor who says, I'm a very slender actor, and in fact they're a bit overweight?
You do occasionally get someone. Well, I work with a blind theatre company of blind performers, and one of the actors described himself as working out. So like he looked like he worked out, and one of the other actors said to me, "Does he really look like that?" I said, "Well, I changed it to he tells me he works out for the sake
Um,
of honesty. It's
yeah.
difficult.
Yeah, and race, as you say, is so relevant now. Do you have rules on that, or is each example different?
Each example is different because race is used in different ways. I mean,
Mm,
sometimes it's what they call colorblind casting. So the director has decided not to cast according to typical stereotypical racial relations at the time. So in a Jane Austen adaptation, you might not have a white Darcy and a black servant or maid. But then at other times, it just happens, that's deliberate. And because that's deliberate, you might want your blind audience to know. Or in Carousel once, Mr. Snow was played by Clive Rowe, who's a black actor. And so when Mr. Snow arrives and he's black, the audience laughed. So your blind audience needs to know why the audience is laughing.
mm. That's that's
Disconnect.
really interesting. And I was thinking, to me, the obvious one is David Copperfield, the recent film version of that. I don't know if
Right.
you've seen that, where there is colorblind casting, and so something like that. Would that be in the kind of notes before you start to see the film, and then you don't mention it again unless it's part of the plot? Or
Unless it's relevant. I mean, in something like The Last King of Scotland, race is very relevant. And there was just some very kind of interesting scenes when Idi Amin is holding the hand of the very pale Scottish doctor. And you get this kind of color contrast that might be interesting visually,
mm, mm,
as
yeah.
well as all the associations to do with power and lack of power that's been flipped in that scenario.
Mm-hmm. So would all of these discussions be part of the training of someone who wants to do audio description? Because it has become much more formal, hasn't it, than when you described it starting a few years ago?
Yeah. No, I mean, there's much more of an academic side to it now that didn't
Mm.
exist when I started.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think, what kind of person would make a good audio describer, do you think?
Someone who's passionate about theatre, who loves theatre, who's interested in words, either speaking them or writing them. It's a really interesting combination of writing and speaking.
Mm.
Emotion is expressed through the voice, but the kind of specificity of the word choice is really important.
Mm-hmm. And
So,
you've actually, as well as doing this, you are now an academic, aren't you? So you did your PhD in this area. Can you tell us a bit more about your research?
yeah, my research I was really interested to know. I was inspired by going to a very poorly described play. And I wanted to know if it was just poor, in my opinion, or whether or not there was a way of kind of benchmarking quality in description. So I then became very fascinated by how someone with no sight could immerse themselves in a visual medium. And so that's what I explored in my PhD. And I came up across a concept called presence, which is a theory of media immersion, usually used in gaming and virtual reality.
Right.
It seemed really apt because a lot of the research up to that point has been about comprehension. So did the blind person understand the play? And that's one element, but I think it's only one element. I think
Mm.
being caught up in it so that you forget that it's being described, you forget it's being performed on the stage, you feel so much part of it. To me, that's the real stamp of success.
Yeah. And is it different depending on whether you've been blind since birth, or and can you cater for that in the audio description? Is it something you're aware of?
It's something I'm very aware of, and it's very much a shortcoming in description in that currently there is only one description, so you can't tailor it to your different audiences. But the blind community is very heterogeneous, so people are born blind, but by far the majority lose their sight later in life. So you might have an accident, you might have an illness, you might gradually lose your sight, you might lose it overnight. And all these things make a difference to what they're interested in hearing about in terms of the visual world. So whether color is relevant, might depend on whether or not you have a visual memory, retain a visual memory, or actually have some residual vision. In fact, most blind people have some usable vision. It might not be very much, might not be enough to get around, or it might be good to get around, but not good for seeing fine detail. So then describing color can really help, because you've got a little bit of vision and you're told somebody's wearing red or a very vivid color, you might be able to pick them out from a kind of fuzzy blur.
Mm-hmm.
But for others, it's just not relevant.
Yeah, and you describe art as well, don't you? Is that right? I mean, I can't imagine how you would do that. That must be so hard.
It's the whole thing about a picture paints 1,000 words, isn't it? But
Yeah.
actually, quite a lot in 1,000 words. And it's otherwise, if you don't even try, then there's nothing for a blind person in an art gallery. If you can't touch anything, or some kind of atmosphere in the space, and that's it. So if you can provide some kind of color and information about the artist and what they're trying to achieve in the picture, give them possibilities, because it's not definitive. I think that's probably the difficulty with art, is that there's no one reading to say this abstract image is you can say it consists of 5 squares in a row and one is slightly more purple than the other 4, if you're describing a Rothko. But it's about atmosphere and why people are drawn to it. So you try and describe what's engaging about it, and then weave in bits of the history of the painter and why the painting was commissioned, and what's it doing on the wall, and why it's in this particular exhibition. So what is it surrounded by, how it relates to other paintings. So actually there's always loads to say.
Yeah, it was really interesting as I was listening to you. You were describing being in a gallery, which was fantastic. I wondered if there's any work of art that you feel you described really successfully, and why it was so successful.
Oh, that's a very difficult question. There's a very beautiful description, which I only had a partial hand in. That's the other thing to say, is that very rarely does a describer work on their own. So normally I would describe with a colleague, and then we'd have maybe an editor who then reads our descriptions and says, well, I've not seen this painting and this means nothing to me at all.
Right.
Then you try and give them a bit more detail. And so there's a very beautiful description by a colleague of mine of a John Constable painting of a cathedral in Salisbury. I think it's Salisbury Cathedral. It's sitting in a water meadow and the light is very beautiful. And so I think that's one of the most successful. And that's all to do with word choice and juxtaposition. So what you end with, how you start, I mean, it's like your writing courses. I mean, you can't just launch in and jump about saying, oh, there's a nice thing over here. And in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a fascinating little, oh, I wish you could see this. All the kind of things you try and avoid. So giving this something vivid to start with, some kind of structure, some kind of logical route around the painting, and then an image to take away. That's the idea.
And so would a blind person kind of listen to it before it went live, before you dispersed it? Yeah,
we always have a blind person who comes and checks it out. The other thing that's really difficult is trying to make people independent enough that they can navigate the gallery on their own.
Yeah.
Describe how to get from one exhibit to the next is really tricky. And it's, you move 4 paces to the left. Some people are taller than other people. They walk much further with 4 paces. And that kind of thing we try out. And for blind people, I've kind of almost, put them at risk by saying, oh yeah, some stairs there. I didn't notice the stairs. So it's always good to have it tested.
And would that description be different from the description a sighted person might hear in somewhere like a museum or an art gallery?
It would be more extensive. So the difference between an audio guide and an audio descriptive guide is really the level of detail. I think with an audio guide, you would assume that a person can see. So you might point out what they can see. So it's guided looking, but you wouldn't go into so much detail about what the church, you might just say, the church on the right was painted by Chagall when, as a memory of his childhood and whatever. But for a blind person, you say the church on the right, which has a white door and stained glass windows and a tiled roof and a cockerel weather vane on the top, that kind of thing. add in the detail at that point,
Mm.
which again can be useful for sighted people. In fact, a friend of mine is doing her PhD on museums and on what difference it makes to sighted people listening to the audio description. And what she's found is that they remember much more. So if you test them again later about what they recall much more vividly what the thing looked like, and they can engage with it on a much more emotional level.
That's so interesting, because it's a bit like, you know, that saying about radio having the best
Yeah.
pictures, because you engage in a different way, don't you?
Yes. I mean, my PhD was very much about the cognitive side, and so how your own memory contributes to what you see.
Mm.
I think it's all about eyes, but actually seeing is about the brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your optic nerve obviously links directly to the visual parts of your brain.
Mm.
And that relates to how much you know already and what you recall and your emotional response. So they're all linked. And the kind of physical side of seeing is not like a kind of camera image on a screen on the back of the retina. It's about the bits that you feed in from the rest of your experience.
Mm-hmm. So
Summary.
I wanted to have this conversation for a long time, but it feels like a different conversation because of the pandemic and being isolated, and it's made me think of how our senses have been curtailed in lots of different ways. For example, I mean, I hope you don't mind me saying, but you are now a grandmother, and I don't think you've held your granddaughter yet, have you?
Desperate. No, it's the worst thing about the pandemic is
Yeah.
that your natural response, my natural response, is to kind of jump in a car and go and see this new baby and give
Mm.
it a cuddle. But we can't do that.
Mm. So has that made you think any differently about audio description and how it might fit into other senses?
What I think it's made me think about is how words have to supplant our other responses, or how they are a kind of fallback mechanism. So, I mean, I can't go to Africa and see lots of things, but I can read about them in a travel book, and that for me is just as vivid. I think when people say, surely you can't describe X, Y, and Z, or how can people relate to the world through that, I think they forget about books being such a kind of crucial immersive, kind of the first immersive.
Mm.
And so the words for me are very rich.
Mm.
And so
And that's what we've found in our teaching, because it's had to be remote, obviously, and I was really worried about that at the start. But I think it's been really important, because I know how much I've looked forward to seeing my students, and how it's been very important for many people who wouldn't have seen anyone else during that period. And even if they can't see the screen, or they become tired by watching the screen, listening to other people has been so important. So I think it has made me aware of words in a different way.
I think that's very interesting in relation to blindness, in
Mm.
that I think people think, oh, it's a total tragedy, you know, I wouldn't survive if I was blind. And actually people do survive, and they survive, I think, because of touch, which obviously we can't have now, but also because of language. So the fact that you could still communicate, you could still share responses to a stimulus, so a play or a film, that's what's important. And that's why I think audio description has a role to play.
Mm. And do you also describe musical events as well?
Yes, it sounds weird, doesn't it? I've described the proms a couple of times.
Yeah, yes, of course, yeah.
And I mean, partly on the radio, I did it a lot. I used to work for Radio 3. And then, but for blind people in the hall, you can be excluded from all sorts of things. So when you first arrive at a concert, it's, you know, what's on the stage ready. It's kind of priming you for what's going to happen next. So is there a huge orchestral section laid out? Is there a big percussion section, lots and lots of chairs on the platform, or is there nothing at all? I mean, in the proms, to try and make it more appealing for people on the telly, they've introduced a kind of LED screen around the back of the Royal Albert Hall stage. And kind of why? And is it necessary? I don't know, but it's there. And
Mm.
therefore, if you want to fully share in the perception of all the people around you, you need to be told that it's there.
Yeah, and also that bit before a performance starts is so exciting, isn't it? And seeing how nervous the performers are and what they're wearing, and and I imagine not knowing about that, you'd feel so excluded from it all.
I think so. I think it's a massive thing about inclusion, and it's very easy to be excluded through people not thinking about what's relevant and what you might want to know.
Hmm. So do you
So,
think there's any area left to describe that you don't describe at the moment? Are you going to be describing Zoom meetings, for example?
well, you say that. I think the answer is yes. I mean, there's all sorts of things in the Zoom call that you get excluded from, things like the number of participants, and there are always little tiny things hidden around your computer screen, and whether or not you mute your audio or you cut off your video, and who's in full vision and who's not. That kind of thing can be difficult to negotiate if you're a blind person.
Hmm.
But lots of on-screen kind of clever computer devices that will read things to you. And blind people are very good at having multiple sources of information, audio information.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll have their computer screen reading to them. Oh, I mean, I can't begin to imagine how you navigate the web as a blind person, because
Yeah.
you can't scan. You have this little computerized voice telling you everything that's on the screen. So trying to select and jump from one thing to another, it's very difficult.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but
So
all of those visual clues in a Zoom meeting are the things that just make it bearable and quite often hysterical. It would be a real shame if you couldn't see someone picking their nose or, eating crisps or something like that. So, and I guess a computer wouldn't pick that up to the same extent that a human would.
are trying to do automated description. And
Mm.
what they find is that computers are very good at identifying individual things, but not at linking them up. So they might describe the heroine of a film. They might say a woman stands by the seashore, but they wouldn't know that in the next frame it was the same woman who was then climbing into a boat. It would be a woman climbs into a boat.
Mm.
There's no continuity, there's no persistence of
Mm.
image. And
Mm.
that's what humans can do really easily.
Yeah, yeah. And how many blind people are there in the UK and in the world?
Kind of depends how you count
Yeah.
blind, but
Mm.
people with some degree of visual impairment,
Mm.
enough to inhibit their daily interaction. There are
Mm.
about 2 million in the UK and
Right.
about 50 million worldwide.
Yeah. And how many audio describers say in the UK?
I don't know. I'm guessing about 100. I'm not sure at the moment.
Right. Right. So there's a room for a lot more help with audio description then.
Yeah, there are lots more people who need to get involved.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that we can do as educators or anyone out there to make more of this?
I think making people aware that it happens, because I think people still don't know about it. So things like this podcast is really helpful, and alerting people to the fact that there are described versions of the NT at home streams, for example, so that people can find out about it and inform their blind relatives. So the more people who know about it, the more people who talk about it, write about it, the better.
Mm.
I mean, like subtitles, you don't think about subtitles today. It's just subtitled. So if you're deaf or hard of hearing, you have access to the words. But when I started in description, subtitling was still relatively new, and so there are quotas set for subtitling and AD on TV, and subtitling is now 100%, and description is still only about 20%. So it's very small, and it needs to increase. And the
Mm.
reason it's so small is that when the laws were created, it was very new, and there were very few ways of listening to it because you needed special equipment. And now everyone could listen to something being described, but it's not, because it's not legislated for.
Brilliant. Louise, that was so interesting. Thank you ever so much.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you'll be back again for our next conversation. You'll find more information about the books we've mentioned and the courses we run in the description box below.